Today, we are speaking with Cam Dallas, the President and Chief Commercial Officer at Peak Energy.
Peak is a pioneer in the grid scale storage space of battery storage.
They can effectively remove the cost of operating a grid scale battery.
So you've got this giant refrigerator for every gigawatt hour of battery storage. That's on the order of $50 million of cost just to run it. The trigger for us was starting to see real scale and real investment happening in China. Most importantly to our investors, this is one of the largest investment opportunities of our lifetime. Massive amount of investment going into these technologies.
Hey, it's Silas from Clean Techies. Before we get into today's episode, mark your calendars for Tuesday, September 23rd from 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time during Climate Week. That's Tuesday of Climate Week. We are hosting an event titled How to Win in the Anti-Climate Era. This will be an event that includes a live podcast with several panelists, including Augustus Dorico, founder of Rainmaker, Grant Brown, principal at 8090 Industries, and recent podcast guest, Joel Armin Hoyland from Climate Finance Solutions, and a few other incredible founders. Space is very limited, so register today. Link is in the show notes. Okay, today we are speaking with Cam Dallas, the President and Chief Commercial Officer at Peak Energy. At Peak, they are developing sodium-ion batteries to solve the grid energy storage issue specifically. Without spilling all the beans, the key thing to keep in mind here is they can effectively remove the cost of operating a grid-scale battery because this chemistry can operate in high-heat environments, unlike lithium-ion batteries. We didn't have time today, but so you are aware, Cam previously was the Chief Commercial Officer at Enovix for 14 years, which now operates 3 facilities throughout the world and is a public company, just to give you some context on his background. And before we get started with the show, a big shout out to Earth Tech Talent for making this show possible. Earth Tech Talent offers agile, accurate, and affordable recruitment that even a pre-seed startup can afford. To get started, reach out today. All right, enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Silas. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to have you on. I think honestly, this has been coming for a while. We probably should have had Peak on for a while ago, but you guys have some more exciting news and stuff to share. So, just give everybody just a quick introduction to who you are and what you're building today.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So my name is Cam. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Peak Energy, and Peak is a pioneer in the grid scale storage space of battery storage, focused on an emerging technology called sodium-ion batteries, which have been scaling for some time now in China, and we are trying to bring that technology to address the massive opportunity here in the West for large-scale batteries.
So,
Um,
if anybody is not familiar with the battery problem or the battery challenge from an energy perspective, from a grid perspective in
yeah,
the U.S., could you just give like a couple big details on what's going on there, like the very brief history and why we need batteries so much?
sure, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a deep topic around batteries. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, all roads and energy seem to lead back to batteries. As we think about the problem of delivering electricity to people, to businesses, to large users of energy, data centers, industrial sites, batteries can help in a number of ways. I mean, the first and probably the first use case that really emerged was to pair them with renewables. So if you think about solar and wind, the sun doesn't shine at night. As we deploy to the grid in larger and larger quantities of particularly solar, you get this massive amount of energy during the day, particularly at the peak time, to the point where, in large scale deployments like in Texas and in California, you have what's called curtailment, where literally they pay you to turn your power plants off because there's so much solar energy. So
Yeah.
what the first kind of obvious use case for batteries is really to suck up all that essentially cheap, almost free solar energy during the day, then deploy it at a later time in the day when the peak of demand hits, which is, typically late in the afternoon. So
Mhm.
that's really what started the industry thinking about large batteries and then ultimately moving to large scale deployment, a few years ago. Since then, there are, large opportunities and use cases that have emerged that really have nothing to do with renewable energy. And this is focused on pairing large scale batteries with large loads that we want to put to the grid. Could be paired with all sorts of generation sources, natural gas peaker plants, et cetera, or just standalone battery storage projects that essentially allow us to raise the total capacity of electricity that the grid can provide, essentially leveling out kind of the peaks and demands, or the peaks and valleys in demand, and matching that better with the supply curve. And
Hmm.
so I would say in the more recent times, more and more of the demand for large scale grid batteries is coming from that. And in some ways, and we can talk more about this, it's probably the fastest and lowest cost ways to add base load generation capacity to the grid to allow us to hook up data
Yeah.
centers for AI and manufacturing capabilities, et cetera. These are all bottlenecked by energy, and I think batteries are one of the key unlocks for that.
And so we're at a point now where there still needs to be just massive amounts more batteries on the grid, whether that's distributed energy resources or on the utility scale. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the estimates from credible research organizations for how much battery needs to be deployed, they keep going up. Like every 3 months, something new comes. A new report comes up. It's higher than the last one. The last reporting we saw was something on the order of 100 gigawatt hours of capacity needed per year by 2030 in the U.S. alone. And it's probably 4 to 5 times that worldwide. So this is a massive amount of capacity in terms of
Got
the
it.
ability to store energy.
Yeah.
So yeah, the opportunity is massive. It's probably $1 trillion of investment that's going to go in the ground over the next 10 years worldwide. And shockingly, despite the fact that we in the battery industry have been talking about grid storage for seems like forever, it really didn't get going in terms of real deployment probably until maybe 2 years ago, when
Hmm.
the economics got to the point where it just became a no-brainer
Yeah.
and just massive investment going into the space.
Yeah. And just to clarify, did the economics suddenly make sense because of how many issues utilities were facing, or because the cost of batteries went down?
Both.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of lithium-ion batteries have gone down by a factor of three over the last 2 years, which is a massive drop. This is coming on, a learning curve that's probably reducing the cost in half, every 2 to 3 years over the last 20 years, and shows no real signs of abating. Although each of the kind of specific technologies that we're talking about in terms of battery technology, various flavors of lithium-ion batteries so far, each of these new kind of generations and flavors of chemistry are part of that overall massive cost down learning curve that we've seen historically over the
Yeah.
last 2 decades. And,
Hmm.
we view sodium as being kind of the next leg. It's a sister technology to lithium ion. It'll continue to bring the cost down further just on the pure capital cost of these batteries. But what we think is really exciting about it is it starts to attack a part of the cost curve that really has not been addressed, which is the operating cost of what are essentially small power plants. Even though you're charging that power plant up at one point in the day and then discharging it later, but the cost to operate these plants has actually become now the dominant part of the total cost to deploy and operate the project here. And sodium has some pretty unique advantages in terms of how it performs as a chemistry that allows us to make a big change in how these plants perform over time.
Hmm. Yeah, so talk a little bit more about this. Back up just a tad. So you guys
Sure.
are building a different type of battery, and that you said sodium. Just for people, again, myself included, I'm not super technical. So give us the breakdown of the
Yeah.
key differences here, and then
Sure.
let's walk through kind of point by point the core benefits of this tech over lithium from your perspective.
Sure, absolutely. So sodium ion batteries are very similar to lithium ion batteries. So they look the same. They're made on the same production equipment. They have an anode and a cathode, a minus and a plus, and a separator in between. Virtually everything is the same about the battery, other than the core chemistry that ultimately goes into the materials that store energy. And so a lithium ion battery, like a sodium battery, the way it stores energy is when you apply a voltage to it, it causes an electrochemical reaction. And in the case of lithium, a lithium ion goes from the cathode and moves over with its charge to the negative side, and that's how you store energy. And then when you discharge the battery, it goes back the other way in a reversible reaction. Sodium ions are batteries are the same. They just use a different chemistry system to accomplish essentially the same task. And so rather than lithium ions carrying that charge back and forth between the plus and the minus, the same reactions occur, or similar reactions occur with sodium ions. And so this is a technology that's been in the lab almost as long, probably actually as long as lithium ion was. But the main, downside of sodium ion batteries is that they have a slightly lower energy density to them, meaning they're a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier per the amount of energy that they can carry than lithium ion. And so back in the 80s and 90s, as lithium ion was being commercialized, the first lithium ion cell coming out commercially by Sony in 1991, sodium was always the second choice because the initial use cases were, Sony's camcorder. It was, your mobile phone that's in your pocket today. Then, a larger but still mobile device, your EV, your electric vehicle. All of these things where energy density is an important factor in the use case for that battery, basically chose lithium ion. Now what we see is you've got this grid storage use case, which, as we noted, started to become a mega market on its own over the last couple of years. And this is a use case where the battery doesn't move. It's a
Yeah.
stationary storage. Typically, there are large installations with hundreds of, 20, 30-foot container sized batteries that are large enough to power a small city. Turns out that the actual footprint of the battery system themselves is no longer the number one factor. Number one factor for sure is cost, but there's other pieces like fire safety, like the abundance of the materials that go into the cell, the security of that supply chain. All these things are important and probably more important factors in the overall kind of performance matrix of the battery technology, and that's what's causing people to start to look at other forms of chemistry to build batteries that are really purpose built for the grid. Whereas
Hmm.
lithium-ion batteries grew up through mobile, then got to scale through the EV space, and then they're sort of the de facto choice for the grid. Really not the ideal chemistry for
Yeah.
the problems that we're trying to solve there. And there's other chemistries like sodium, which we feel are much better suited for this, but yet are part of the overall scaling in terms of the supply chain and the manufacturing capability that was built out through lithium. And so can take advantage of that.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, what is the core reason why it's cheaper in the first place? Why is it cheaper to build sodium ion compared to lithium? Is it supply chain related? Like where does that reduction in cost come from?
Yeah, so there's two factors. So the first is in the actual cost to buy the cells and then ultimately to buy the systems. Today, they're actually not cheaper than LFP lithium ion cells. They have a cost disadvantage that's on the order of, let's call it, 20, 30%, something like that. Although it's on a cost reduction curve that will cross over with LFP over the next 3 or 4 years. The reason for the fundamental cost advantage there as sodium scales really comes down to just the cost of atoms of the materials that go into the cell. So you're really talking about sodium. Salt comes from soda ash, which is one of the most abundant materials on Earth. Soda ash is mined all over the world. Largest mines in the world are actually in Wyoming. And soda ash is a raw material that goes into essentially all sort of common glass in the world. So every window and beer bottle in the world is made out of soda. Soda ash originally, basically the sodium carbonate that comes into soda lime glass. So highly abundant resource. Um, and then iron and then phosphates. And, phosphates basically similar to fertilizers that you spread on the ground. So you have a battery that has highly abundant supply chain in terms of materials, which ultimately drive a lower fundamental cost structure for the cell. But, as I mentioned earlier, it's only one piece of the total cost of running a plant that can produce or store, in this case, energy for the grid. A piece of that is how much does it cost to build the batteries and put them on the grid, right? And 5 years ago, that was dominated by the cell cost. But as the cell cost has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time, it's actually become one of the smaller components in the total cost of ownership of this whole plant and the project. And so, what does it cost to run an installed lithium ion battery system today? It really is mostly based on a couple of factors. The first is, how much energy that you put into the battery, how much do you get back out? Something called round trip efficiency, and sodium ion batteries just perform better than lithium in that case. So you lose less energy going in and out. That becomes revenue that the plant owner can access. Second piece, and this is the one that really sort of drives the overall operating cost, is if you think about what a lithium ion battery system looks like, it's basically this 30-foot container, might be hundreds of these sitting out into the desert. And lithium ion batteries are very sensitive in terms of the conditions that they can operate in and still maintain a 20-year operating life. So an LFP system typically spec'd at 25 degrees centigrade, plus or minus 2 degrees. So you've got this giant refrigerator sitting in the desert that has to operate for 20 years. That's basically what a lithium ion battery is in grid storage. And so, what does that mean from a practical perspective? It means, first of all, you're running the air conditioner for 20 years. There's something like for every gigawatt hour of battery storage, that's on the order of $50 million of cost just to run it. Um, in addition, as you look at kind of the Pareto of all the things that can go wrong in a battery system, these days it's typically not the cell that fails. It's typically that system that is running. It's the pumps and the compressors and the chillers and the coolant lines and the fittings that can leak, and all of these pieces that require maintenance and preventive maintenance, all of this stuff just to keep that LFP lithium ion battery in its perfect, pristine
Mm.
environment. Sodium, on the other hand, the downside is that it is a little bit larger, about a 40% penalty in volumetric energy density. But the reason why it's larger and has less energy in it is the flip side of that is actually that it is more stable, and the chemistry is able to operate and last for the full lifetime of the project at much higher temperature ranges than a lithium battery. And so kind of the core innovation of what Peak is bringing to market is essentially taking advantage of that stability in the sodium ion cell to eliminate all of the operating moving parts in the battery system. And so you're not paying to run it, in terms of the chillers and essentially the auxiliary power to run the system, keep it cool. All those components that fail literally don't exist on the system at all. We're a group heavily influenced by experiences at Tesla and other places. Probably 60% of companies ex Tesla. There's a famous saying, best part is no part. And so we've taken that to heart around the storage system. All those parts, top 10 parts that fail on a system, do not exist on our battery. And so you end up with something that is what we call a completely passive system. There are no moving parts. In fact, there's no preventive maintenance at all. And so
Mm.
you have something that's just super stable, very reliable. You put it into operation and the thing just runs. And that adds up to what is essentially over 20 years on the order of $75 per kilowatt hour of cost savings on a kind of a net present value. So if you take all those savings over 20 years, you discount those back to today's dollars, it's about $75 per kilowatt hour, which, by the way, is the order of magnitude that it costs to install the system in the first place. So you're almost getting full battery system for free if you take into account the operating savings over the
Interesting.
life of
So,
a
so just
system.
to, so just so I got that right, so you're saying that it's basically over the lifetime compared when you're comparing apples to apples, right? From lithium versus sodium, it's about
Yep,
$75 per kilowatt hour cheaper in
correct.
total energy
Today's dollars.
produced, basically.
Yep,
Okay, interesting.
yep,
That's a
yep.
that's a big number. That's very
That's a
important to
big
know.
number.
And is it expected? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, you otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. But is it expected that the cost of producing sodium-ion batteries will actually come down as well because there's not been as much
Correct.
investment into it?
No, you're exactly right. And so today we have a small penalty in terms of the upfront capex, swamped by the operating cost advantage. But over time, we expect that the total cost on the capex side to cross over LFP in the next few years, and then continue to drop lower and lower. It'll be part of the overall cost curve we've seen in the industry
Okay,
on batteries in general.
that's it.
Yep.
That's it. That's
So,
helpful.
yep. Yep.
Yeah, and then I guess just to back up, so just to make sure everybody's very clear, if anybody is not familiar, I think most people will be with this, but your
Mm.
customer primarily is you guys are building projects and selling directly to utilities, or working with IPPs. Like who is the customer of your battery technology?
Yeah. So our customers are typically the IPPs.
Okay.
And, in at least in the US market, the utilities are, actually procuring and building their own projects less and less over time. Almost all of the development of projects is being done by the IPPs, the independent power producers. So that's who our customers are, and we've got a handful of really what we think are the best and the brightest of the IPPs who have signed on with us to first work with us on a sodium ion full scale a 3.5 megawatt hour project pilot program that we just shipped about 4 weeks ago out of our engineering center here in California. There's 9 of those IPPs that are part of that program. The program was designed to be a structured way to bring customers into the development process originally. That's what we've been doing for the last 2 years with them, helping us set requirements for our product, making sure that the thing we build is actually what solves the customer's problem. And now we've moved to the deployment phase, and this is really sort of the first real world non-lab experiences that they will have, running a full scale sodium ion battery system, and it's kind of the first in a series of steps that ultimately bring the risk of a new technology to a point where you can deploy it at full scale.
Yeah, so I want you to maybe back up a tad and break this down, because if I understand correctly, you're saying that you guys are funding your own pilot project, but getting other people
Mm,
involved in order to have
mm,
some control over it, rather than what's pretty common is to kind of get into, I don't know what they call it, like pilot purgatory, where you just keep doing pilot after pilot before you can ever
yeah,
get to a commercial. It ends up using up your balance sheet. So can you just
yep,
talk about
yep,
how you structured this and maybe the core components? Because if somebody's trying to build a
sure,
pilot that's not in the battery space, just what are the
yep.
core components to doing something like this, and who are the parties involved?
Yeah, no, happy to do that, and you're absolutely right. I think in our space and the energy space in particular, we looked at it and we call it getting piloted to death.
Mm.
And every customer that you want to work with on a new technology, they need to show that the technology works, that it really meets the claims, that it's economical, and so they want to do a pilot. And it's really tempting to say, "Great, let's do a pilot. We'll show customer traction." But as you point out, you can end up in this kind of endless loop of, 4, 5, 6, 10 customers all doing a pilot. These are all small, subscale, essentially non-economic projects.
And just to
And
clarify, usually who pays for those in most cases?
usually customer pays for those.
Okay.
And so, another reason why it's very tempting, even though it's not, huge revenue, it shows commercial traction. You can show your investors that you're generating some revenue. These are, paid for projects, et cetera. So there's value to that. But I think our point of view was that that's a trap ultimately for the company. And we wanted to basically pull that piloting activity together so that we only have to do it once.
Okay.
And so we started thinking about, kind of consortium models. Essentially, every one of those pilots is trying to prove the same thing. It's trying to show that you as a new company can actually build something and deliver it, that the quality is there, that the technology meets its claims, its promises. In our case, that's things like its high temperature lifetime, its round trip efficiency, all these claims that we've made based on lab data. Now we're showing this in a full scale unit. And so the way we decided to structure it is to bring this whole thing into a structured program. We gave it a cheesy name, Peak Pilot Program. Everyone remembers that, PPP. And in the first year and a half of the program was really working with customers through our development of the technology. And so we literally have a formal set of reports that we ship, every 6 weeks or so. In the beginning, it was things like lab testing of the cells. Then it was our first module performance testing. Eventually, it became, kind of testing of the full system in the lab. And then what happened this summer is then we moved into the operational piece where we shipped this full-scale system to a site that we control. And again, we're paying for all this. It costs us, it's not a huge amount of money, but it's in the, call it couple million dollars of investment. And so the key piece to the whole program, though, is like it's very easy to get somebody to um, come participate and watch what you're doing for free. That's really not a very high bar. So it put a high bar on our team to go qualify customers that could really then move forward with real projects and have them enter the program with that as essentially the quid pro quo. And we typically told people that to participate in the program, you either needed to make an investment in the company. We've got 3 or 4 customers who did that, or you need to sign some sort of documentation that lays out the expectations that if we're successful, we meet requirements and the that the economics are what we say they are, that we will then move together forward into real commercial projects. And that could be an MOU or something along those lines. And in my view, there's kind of 2 types of MOUs. There's the sort of BS MOU that isn't worth the paper that it's written on. That's not what this is. These are typically multi-page documents. Actually, to our surprise, but our happy surprise, most companies took this. Actually, all companies took this quite seriously. It's technically a non-binding document, but they viewed it as an important mutual commitment essentially to the project as a whole. And typically these documents went up all the way to the CEO and got signed. So
Mm.
it was like not a 2-week process to get this MOU signed. It was a long-term, kind of really it's a sales cycle, right? Of
Yeah.
going through
I was gonna say almost like a
proving,
real full size sales cycle.
yep. And then ultimately got signed. And now we're seeing the fruits of that now where several of these PPP participants have now moved forward with commercial agreements to do real projects. So we've got 4 projects starting in 2026, which are, real revenue generating and for the customer revenue generating projects that are on the books. And then our first, I would call it full scale project, which is in contracting now for 2027, which is more than $100 million full scale project. So
Mhm.
we use this pilot program as a way to have a low barrier to entry into a new technology in an industry that is notoriously risk averse, but then ultimately generated a path to reduce risk step by step and increase um, you know essentially commercial agreement in hand as we reduce risk. And ultimately everybody's goal is to bring a technology to market that can ultimately generate significant competitive advantage for people who are deploying it.
Hiring is a pain. Posting jobs usually means a pile of low quality applicants to sort through, but going out and finding them yourself also takes a long time. And usually, using a headhunter to save you time often costs too much money, but not anymore. Earth Tech Talent works specifically with early stage clean tech startups to hire the best talent so you can hit your next milestone. We work at prices that even a pre seed startup can afford. So save yourself some time and money on your recruitment by reaching out today. The best part is we offer a hiring guarantee. So if the candidate isn't the right fit, you get your money back. To get in touch, reach out to me on LinkedIn or go to earthtechtalent.com/contact. That's Earth, ERTH, techtalent.com/contact. All right. Happy hunting. Okay. So I want to make sure I've got a couple of these components right, just to break this down even further. So was this one pilot project that you developed and then got other people to participate, or did you develop multiple at different sites for the partners that you were working with?
One pilot project which we own and operate,
Okay.
and there's 9 companies that are involved in that pilot program, and they all have data rights to the
I see.
to what we generate. They have the ability, if they so desire, to run their own custom protocols on the unit, et cetera, et cetera. They may
So, so,
use that
so the
as a
main
kind of a key risk reduction.
So the main point here is being you only had to build it once, and they get
Hmm.
visibility into actually seeing how it's operating, and you're being like, hey,
Hmm.
look at our books, so to speak,
Yep,
about the actual tech, and that's what de-risked it for them, and that's what they said, okay, cool, we're more interested now.
exactly,
Because
exactly.
before, if you had told them a pilot, they're it seems like maybe pilots aren't that difficult to come by, but then you only have it with one customer, and you essentially take on some
Correct.
risk because you've had to still go through all the the headache of building this pilot, and only one customer is a hypothetical buyer versus in this case you build one product and you have nine hypothetical customers.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
the idea.
And then, okay, so I think I've got that. The the reason I wanted to ask about the cost piece and why you guys had to deploy is because you had to fund it so that you could offer the data rights to everybody, right? If it was funded by the customer, they wouldn't allow that, correct? In like almost no case.
Typically that, yeah, typically that would be the case. I mean, I guess the ideal situation is you find a customer who is happy to pay you for a proprietary pilot and then is
Yeah.
happy to give all the data to their competitor. We didn't actually try to do that, but
Yeah.
I think you can imagine that might be a challenge.
Yeah, yeah, I could see. So just so other people understand that that's like a very clever way of focusing on, what can we do with our limited resources? Yes, we'll pay for these things, but I also like the
Mhm.
point of because it was a low barrier to entry, you had to put the due diligence on your side, right? You had to be careful about who you would invite because you wanted those
Yeah,
people to be true, potential buyers. Would there be any sort of
correct.
limit on how many could participate? Like, could it have been more than nine if you wanted it to?
It, I would say that it is, there's a bit of a blurry line, particularly now, as the thing is in the field, we're using it more and more as a, as a sales tool, right?
Yeah.
For people to come in and look and see and kick the tires for themselves. I think there's not a hard and fast rule. We tried to be judicious with who we partnered up with,
Mm-hmm.
mostly for bandwidth reasons. Because
Mm-hmm.
like, we're a small team. Um, we wanted to, we wanted to have enough capability and just attention, in terms of our team working with these customers. And we, look in our world, we don't need 1,000 customers. We don't need
Mm-hmm.
50 customers. We need like five, maybe less, really good customers who are leaning forward, and each one of those could essentially buy out all of our capacity for the next 10 years. So it's really about quality of relationship as opposed to quantity.
Now, one thing I wanted to understand as well is I still don't understand why were they so particular about making sure that even the CEO was involved in the decision for the MOU. Like, what caused them to go that route? Because you guys put together like a more in depth kind of commitment thing.
It's a great question. I don't know for sure why that
Mm,
happened. Like I said, it was a bit surprising to me that it became, such a serious endeavor on their end. But it's a happy thing because,
yeah,
you could look at it and go, "Oh my God, this has to go to the CEO for them to sign this document. Like, just get the damn thing signed." I actually look at it like, all right, that's great. This document
yeah,
has to go to the CEO.
sure.
Let's have a meeting with him or her, and then we can really understand, from their perspective, what they're trying to accomplish, and what we need to do to go win their business. And it's not all on the technology side, right? There's, in our space, there's, serious considerations around bankability and, you know proving out your capability as a supplier, and then having the financial wherewithal to stand behind your products, as they go into the field on warranty. So it turned out to be a real plus and a relationship building tool. And I think, like, in the end, if you write these documents in a specific way with real asks, even if it's quote non-binding from a legal perspective, your counterparty on the other side wants to live up to that.
Mm,
And we were dealing with directors and vice presidents, et cetera, and those people felt like they were making a commitment on behalf of the company, whether or not it was legal, in terms of the document.
yeah.
And so they wanted to make sure that they had done their homework with their management chain. And if they're promising that they're going to go spend money with us and do a project, they felt like they needed to mean it, and they needed to get the backup from their team. So I'm not sure that was exactly the plan when we started, but it turned
Mhm.
out to be a really powerful part of the whole process.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, some of these things you don't have to be a master, some kind of genius to figure it out. You just gotta let things fall the way they fall, and you see how it comes out. Right. In this case, it's a very fascinating insight that I'm glad we were able to pull out because I think other people should see if there's ways that they can replicate the same kind of commitment levels. But Now, always very curious when you're building something this difficult, this hardware intensive. How do you then translate from where you are now to then actually building out production capacity, right? So you've got some
Right.
commitments for, you said, I think, 4 projects, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know what capacity those require, but how do you go from this to eventually building like a gigafactory that produces these things?
Yeah, yeah, no, work in progress. So, like, I can't say that we have all the answers, but what we decided to do from the beginning, and we're kind of still on this plan, is, we were. It's not really lucky enough, but part of the reason why we started the company and decided to go after this opportunity with sodium ion was that we started to see it scaling up in China, which in our world of batteries, it doesn't really matter how fundamentally good your technology might be. If it doesn't get to scale, it's really not relevant, and you're not going to hit the cost targets, even if on a theoretical basis you're better than the incumbent. And so, the trigger for us was starting to see real scale and real investment happening in China. What that allowed us to do is to try to build a multi-phase plan to to first prove the technology, get customer adoption, develop the market for this new technology and in the utility and IPP space. And we did that through purchasing sodium ion cells from our partners in Asia who are in production today. And so what we've had to go build and fund is the ESS system itself that is fully passive. There's as good as the sodium chemistry is, there's a huge amount of engineering that goes into um, allowing that thing to operate reliably for 20 years and dealing with the thermal controls, et cetera. Just because it's passive doesn't mean it's easier. In fact, it's harder. So we focused on that piece, and we focused on the market development, customer development piece through the pilot program, and that allows us to get systems in the field. These first projects in 2026, and then large project in 2027, and then we'll continue to grow without having to, from the beginning, own and operate our own battery factory, which is sort
Mm.
of a $500 million level of capital. And so the way we've thought about it is that first phase, we rely on our partners to produce cells and we produce systems. In parallel, we're working on phase two now, which is, ultimately building out a full scale domestic battery cell factory here in the US to produce sodium ion cells. Even that situation, we're not doing that on our own. We're doing that in conjunction with our partners overseas, guys who are supplying cells to us today, working with them to essentially bring that technology here in the States. And, part of what our DNA is as a company is it's a group of operators who have been part of 5 gigafactory cell manufacturing gigafactories around the world, trying to bring them together here to go make that happen in the US. And so that's kind of the second phase. And then in parallel to that, um, we have a fairly substantial investment in next generation R&D. And so we have a cell R&D and engineering center in Denver, Colorado, with a really high performance team there that is doing both in-house R&D on certain aspects of improving the cell performance, as well as working with a pretty wide array of partners there. So there's a number of R&D level, typically chemistry companies, both here and overseas, that are looking at kind of next generation cathodes, next generation anodes for sodium ion cells. And the goal there is to, when those R&D programs, come to fruition, that will be a scaled player and can then get to Gen 2 when everybody else in the market is waking up
Mm.
to where sodium is as it starts to take share.
So I want to back this up just a tad to make sure I've got this correct. So the first plan is effectively take the existing suppliers of these cells. So they're making the cells. You guys are packaging the system. So it's kind of like, buy in. I guess you'd say like, upsell, if you will. But maybe a bad analogy. But you're taking something that exists without reinventing the wheel, and then
Yeah.
you've done the kind of the moat that you have is focused right now on the customer side of things, and you can continue to deliver what the customer needs for a period of time until you get to a very large set of demand. And once you get to that very, very large set of customer demand, you will then probably have enough um, I guess you'd say, traction to then either go raise private equity or a debt facility to build your gigafactory. You wouldn't require to use
That's right.
equity necessarily to do so.
That's right.
And that at that point, then you can run and kind of build the gigafactory and go through production hell.
Yep. That's the goal. I should say that we started off thinking we would just be purchasing quote unquote standard NFPP sodium ion cells out of our partners' factories. What actually happened is we learned and realized, a year and a half ago, how important this operating cost advantage ultimately is going to be to the market, which is something that is really it's unique to the U.S. market in the sense that it's a because it's such a commercial utility system. It shines a light on that type of a capability, which you wouldn't necessarily notice in China, where it's just sort of mandated deliver X amount of capacity. And so, with that unique commercial insight into the value of the operating model, and then translating that into specific functions and capabilities at the cell chemistry level, we ended up working together quite closely with our suppliers to develop proprietary cell technology for this. And so we have
Mm,
agreements with them that are exclusive worldwide around the chemistry that we basically co-developed. So it's blended a bit. It started off thinking we're just going to buy this, and what it ended up being was we ended up working together with suppliers to develop something quite specific for us, but without having to go build, you know, $500 million cell factory right out of the gate, which is, probably not possible for a startup
yeah.
to do that first step.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who's funding you, I suppose, right? But that's interesting. So you're basically saying that you can still develop an IP moat even if you're not the one producing everything. So as long as you have the right
That's right.
partners and have the trust there. So that's fascinating. Um,
That's right.
I think that probably the most important thing to go through next would be supply chain. So can you just talk
Sure.
about how you guys are planning ahead for building your own supply chain to produce in the US? Because obviously we haven't exactly directly talked about it, but it sounds like part of the reason you guys are doing this in the first place is that China is crushing us on pretty much everything when it comes to batteries, and we're again that's across the board of technologies, right, and chemistries. So how are you building that out now, and what is it likely to look like? I know you haven't gotten there yet. What is it likely to look like once you guys get kind of scaled up?
Yeah, sure. So you rightly point out, the supply chains today, even in the sodium ion side, really are dominant in China. And so, we're working with partners there to build cells and ultimately source materials. Um, that said, I would say it's not healthy for the industry or kind of the world at large to have sort of any particular supply chain that's just completely dominated by one country, one part of the world. So whether or not there's sort of the geopolitics of the situation, it's just not a healthy supply chain situation. Our partners there, by the way, agree with that statement. And so, you've seen a couple of things happen. There's sort of that blanket statement. You've, of course, seen significant, movement on the policy side, first with the IRA and then with the OB cubed, as we like to call it, you know, essentially tying the tax credits for deploying batteries in the US to domestic content in those supply chains. And, these things ratchet up over time. And so, all of us in the ecosystem are um, incentivized and focused on diversifying kind of where those materials come from and how they get produced. And so there's, I would say, um, a series of steps to basically move production and then to move materials production ex China. And you're seeing, significant investments in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan, uh, you know, to essentially allow these materials to qualify for the tax incentives. And then there are additional incentives on top of that to basically access domestic content, meaning U.S. production. And so that's part of the reason why we are interested in and actively working on a scale up plan to build a battery factory in the United States. Um, frankly speaking, my last company is a battery company. We built a factory in Malaysia. It's cheaper there than it is in the U.S. And so there needs to be policy incentives to go fully localize, the manufacturing capability. And I think there are good reasons why you might want to do that, but they're primarily national security type reasons
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to purely economic reasons. But
Yeah.
the way the OB Cube kind of finally settled out, it's a bipartisan priority. I personally have spent way more days than I would have wanted to at on Capitol Hill meeting with Congress, in the White House. There's a general consensus across the aisle that batteries are important for the national security of the United States. That has to do with increasing access to grid supply for things like AI. It also is a big piece of kind of reshoring of manufacturing. Batteries themselves go into everything, not just on the grid,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, but also vehicles and drones and all sorts of things that matter. And so I think the country has decided that it wants to have a domestic capability here. And for us, this is a tactical question in terms of um, where we build out our supply chain, where the manufacturing gets done. We will uh, follow kind of what the incentive structure incentivizes us to do. And if it were not to incentivize us to be in the U.S., we would go build out capabilities in other countries. So, but today, strongly focused on doing that here in the U.S. And I think it makes sense to have a capability here for the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning the bipartisan nature of it. Obviously, we did cover this not that long ago. The fact that a lot of the battery aspects of the IRA were
Mhm.
retained but changed to just focus on domestic supply. And then I think there
Yeah.
was also we just recently covered too with Joel about the funding opportunities specifically for the mining, so kind of upstream of the batteries
Mhm.
themselves. So I
Mhm.
definitely we definitely see that interest there. Along with this question though is the or this topic is the question of how do you brand yourself, right? So if you're
Mhm.
focused on like, hey, we're trying to bring clean energy to the grid, the current administration has, outwardly stated that they do not care about that, right? This is not something that's
Mhm.
of interest
Mhm.
to them. The national security pieces are. So,
Mhm.
how do you go about kind of positioning your company from that side of things? I know hiring will be different topics, but like, how do you
Mhm.
publicly
Mhm.
position yourself with a branding perspective in order to get the right parties engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, from the beginning, we do care about clean energy as a mission. I actually think it is relatively bipartisan also. Like nobody wants air pollution in their cities and this sorts of things. Just staying away from maybe the more controversial aspects around climate change and carbon, et cetera. Batteries are a key part of that. They're also a key part, and we talked up front, right, around resilience of the grid and the ability to add significant amounts of what is essentially virtual generation capacity, right, by peak shaving, et cetera. So there's something for everybody to love in the story of batteries. I do think that energy security is national security, probably the most fundamental of the bipartisan kind of viewpoints around this. And we view it no different than, OPEC in the 70s and fracking in the 2000s. As the economy becomes more and more electrified, I mean, you look at like even the oil fields are massively going electric. And this is just creating huge, huge demand for electrons. This is the fundamental battlefield for energy dominance, right? What to use the administration's terms. And so it hasn't been a big problem for us because, it kind of doesn't matter which lens you look at it through. You're going to end up in a position where large scale grid batteries matter, and they matter to the country. They matter from an economics perspective. And, most importantly to our investors, this is one of the largest investment opportunities of our lifetime. A massive amount of investment going into these technologies. And in the end, we're super mission driven, but none of that matters unless you can build a company that can just absolutely print money and create a positive feedback cycle to continue to grow and ultimately accelerate the mission. So we believe like the economics and the mission are intertwined. That's how things happen in a, kind of in our economy and a capitalist economy. And
Hmm.
we're lucky enough to be in a space where those two things really come together.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. No, I appreciate that. I think it's So if I were to summarize my takeaway from what you just said is effectively like we just call ourselves like we're a battery company and we are making better batteries that are going to help solve the issues on the grid.
Mhm.
You know, you're not necessarily focused on the climate issue. Anybody in climate knows what you're doing, you know, knows what you're up to.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
also when you kind of throw in the, you know, to building the domestic supply chain aspects, that then gets the right people interested in as well. So it all
Yeah.
comes down to, like you said, national security, depending on whose perception you're working with here. So you just kind of go that way. And I appreciate you sharing this mainly because there's a lot of founders who I don't think have got the memo yet around how you brand yourself in the current administration. Again, it doesn't all have to do with federal funding. Like there's a lot more
Hmm.
beyond that.
Hmm.
But I do
Hmm.
think that perception and managing the public receptivity is extremely important as a climate tech founder now, because if you do things
Hmm.
wrong and if
Hmm.
you try to the way I like to say it kind of bluntly is if you follow the way of the word police, you can end up with a really bad PR situation on your hand where, you
Sure.
know, a lot of your customers in red states, for example, might just be completely like writing you off and you just don't want to run into these issues. So just
That's right.
focus on solving the problems and the climate benefits kind of as a thing that comes in the background without you having to focus on it per se, right? It's again different if
Yeah.
you're pitching to, you know, climate
Yeah.
investors,
Yeah.
but you know that's another discussion.
But even climate investors, I mean, they are investors
Yep.
first, and they need to make money for their LPs. And we are a commercial enterprise. Our goal is to make a huge amount of money, providing a product that creates a huge amount of value, right?
Hmm.
And um, like you said, the climate benefits come along with that. I think it's obviously batteries are a super big, important part of the solution there. But in the end, this is a company. We're not a charity. We're trying to um, add value to our customers, and then they will reward us, and that will ultimately get the mission done.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Before we run out of time, I would really like to ask you about your kind of hiring thesis because I mean, you've talked a little bit
Mhm.
about the team, you know, being like what 60% people from Tesla, and you have built a battery company in the past. I mean, we don't have time to
Mhm.
tell the origin story there, unfortunately, but can you just explain some of the core, I guess, principles that you have integrated into how you're building the team? How do you get such a crew of people together that can even come up with the idea of your pilot program in the first place? Like how do you do this and what are your core kind of mentalities around building a team?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the founding team, right? So, my background is I'm an engineer for a long time, but I've been on the commercial side for a while now. When I got together with Landon Mossberg, my co-founder, he is much more on the operational side, and then we have a third co-founder who's very much supply chain oriented. And one of the things that particularly in the kind of the deep scientific enterprises, and a lot of the things in energy tend to be very sort of science oriented. So many of those companies are coming out of university labs with sort of founders who are coming from the research side. They're trying to commercialize some research that looks promising for this, that, or the other problem. We really focused on it in the reverse order. When we started talking with the big IPPs directly before we even launched the company. And so there was always a commercial aspect to what we were doing. And, based on, um, Landon and myself and Liam O'Connor, the third founder, we have quite a complementary set of, professional experiences that we bring to the table. So when you ask about, well, why did we end up with the pilot program the way we architected that? How do we get to these large deals early on in the life cycle of the company before we really even have a product, right? It's because one of the founders has a very commercial viewpoint, and it became a priority for the company, and we brought people in to go after that. And then likewise, Liam brings tremendous supply chain experience and operational experience. He ran supply chain for Tesla for Elon. And so it's not a surprise that we have a sophisticated strategy for partnering overseas, working with strong supply chain partners that ultimately will help us scale the company in a way that is far beyond what we could have done, just kind of on our own. And then Landon brings, tremendous operating experience from the battery space. He built and ran the first Norfolk factory, largest lithium-ion battery factory in Europe. Was also a Tesla guy, and so to some sense, the company is a reflection of the founders. I think it's probably true almost for every startup. Um, it's a bit of the strategy is, let's get the band back together. We've all been around the block, so to speak, and have some experiences and have networks of folks that we worked with in the past, and I've tried to bring those teams back to a point where they can work together and hopefully accomplish something in a very meaningful way. So that's kind of the beginning of the company. We're about 100 people now. I would say, the vast majority of folks are folks from our network that we've worked with in the past. And we're at the point now where, like, that's obviously not going to carry us for the next 1,000 people, right? And so now we're in the process of building out, I would say, a more, kind of systematic approach to hiring, and hopefully we've managed to create a culture and a way of working here that is strong and enduring, and it will help attract the kind of the next group of men and women who want to come and build something meaningful.
Yeah, I think this is a super, I guess, underrated, unfair advantage when you have people who are co-founders who have a lot of different past experiences because you can draw less people. It's like, I can go
Yeah.
out and do a search for somebody, and they may be hypothetically on paper better than somebody I worked with in the past, but I know the person I worked with in the past, and I know, how they like to work. I know any of their
Hmm.
weak points. I
Hmm.
know that they can also deliver because they had to deliver in
Hmm.
these circumstances, and I watched them
Sure.
do that. And I think
Yeah.
that this is, again, a disadvantage that's not unovercomable. I don't know if that's a word
Hmm. Hmm.
from
Yeah.
first time founders, but it's something to really consider. Is like maybe get somebody on your team who has those networks who can act as an advisor. Maybe work with the recruiter, obviously, if you're going to have to do that. But it's just like there's going to be less certainty when you already have worked with them, or when you haven't already worked with them. So I appreciate you sharing that. Are there any, I guess, core, things around culture and how you try to make sure the team kind of stays motivated? I can imagine it's not that difficult having a lot of people from Tesla. I mean, I've heard a lot of the kind of the stories of how things are there. So maybe people
Hmm.
are relieved to have slightly less intensity, but still keep moving. Like, how do you keep people motivated, and what are the kind of core focus areas there?
Yeah. Look, I think when all is said and done, my personal view is that you know, whatever pros and cons come from what Elon has done, and will do in the world, one of the perhaps most enduring is the diaspora of talented people that he was able to assemble at his companies, and then those people went through an intensive set of experiences that is pretty unique. Certainly in the Western world, I think it's unique. Maybe you only find a similar experience in Shanghai or Shenzhen or something like that. And so the overriding kind of dynamic there is making hardware cool again, attracting literally the best and the brightest people from all over the world to come work on these mission driven companies, going through a very, very intense experience, a learning experience, but also, for whatever reason, generating a huge number of folks who decide they don't want to work there anymore. and over the last year, that's accelerated, certainly in our view. And I think, partly it's companies have grown up, they've become mature
Mm-hmm.
enterprises, and so the type of people who were attracted to like changing the world are no longer the people needed to like go from 100 billion to 200 billion, right? So that's a different
Mm-hmm.
mentality. There's the political aspect of things, and then there's a focus that's changed maybe from being laser focused on clean energy and EVs and things like that to something that's maybe more AI
Mm-hmm.
oriented, which would be a different thing for different people. And so for us, that's meant um, a rich pool of people, not necessarily all coming directly from those companies, but
Mm-hmm.
who have had those experiences in the past, in combination with people that we started the company with, and then the people who we hired who've have those personal networks. And so we've been able to build, I think, a pretty coherent team with a pretty coherent culture here. It's different than the Tesla culture, right? It's not top down, and driven by fear and getting fired and all that sort of stuff. It's really sort of organically comes from within, and but you match that with a real mission oriented kind of person who's used to working hard, is not scared of working hard, because let's be honest, to get a startup off the ground, this is not a lifestyle business. It is hard,
Yeah.
and people know what it takes. But if that comes from a point of self motivation, that's where the magic really happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so we feel really lucky to have slipstreamed on some of the amazing experiences and capabilities that were developed through those previous work experiences, and now bringing them together here into something that we think is pretty special.
Yeah, no, that's really I really find it fascinating the whole just the number of interesting companies that have come out of people who left Tesla, right? And I think that again,
Yeah.
there's a lot of positive and negative things that come out of it, but it's really fascinating just to see what's going on here and to see that there's a place for these people where they don't have to
Mhm.
be treated as poorly per se, and
Yep.
you can build something. I also do just like one last comment. I find it very interesting how broad the range of people is that work on climate tech because there's a
Mhm.
lot of times
Mhm.
motivated by far different things. Especially the engineering types tend to be so focused on and interested on the technological aspects, right? Because it's just so
Mhm.
fascinating to be part of. So
Yep. Yep.
awesome. Well, we are out of time here, so I guess just last thing I would ask you is like, what are the most exciting things you guys are looking forward to at the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I mean that's an easy question. So we just deployed our pilot, right? And so that's in that's in deployment now, and we'll be hooked up to the grid here in the next couple of weeks. The next phase of the company is really delivering on the first set of projects that our customers have entrusted with us, and so that is that's kind of the next kind of level that the company needs to get to. We're no longer talking about products in theory and benefits in theory. It's all about execution and delivering those projects on time and budget, of getting them to run and operate reliably, and really ultimately demonstrating what we've been claiming for the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now proof's in the pudding.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. It's gotta be pretty rewarding to see that come to fruition. And just maybe one last thing
Yeah,
is how long, I guess, from inception of the company to now, just so I get the timeline.
a little over 2 years.
So that's the very yeah, that's impressive. Yeah, we
Yeah.
should have maybe talked about that at the beginning, but that's a very good number. So awesome. Well, I'm sure we'll have you on again in the future to talk about more of the developments and more of the lessons that come from this, and maybe we can do a whole episode on your past learning experiences because you have a lot of things we didn't get to dive into with your background. But I really appreciate you coming on. Appreciate what you guys are doing, and I'm very excited to see the cost of batteries come down even further.
My pleasure, Silas. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on social media and drop us 5 stars on your favorite podcasting platform. And do not forget, register for our event happening Tuesday of Climate Week. It's September 23rd from 2 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We are hosting an event called How to Win in the Anti-Climate Era. We have an amazing speaker lineup. It'll be a live podcast as well, so you get to be participants there. And I would just recommend that you sign up very quickly because we have very limited space. We can only host 60 people. So if you'd like to come, register. The link is found in the description. We really hope to see you there. All right. See you next time.